implemented a survey to find out what our members thought about this. The full summary is on your table. To summarize the results, if the vote were to be held today, just over 60% of our members would vote to keep the current system. Otherwise, of the proportional representation, our members chose dual member proportional first. Their second choice was mixed member proportional, with the rural-urban proportional last. But what would any change mean to our economy? What system would be best to provide stability and be responsive to business and industry needs? Business leaders have many questions. Our panelists this morning will provide their perspective on these questions, and then it'll be your turn to provide input or ask questions. The Surrey Board of Trade asks for your participation in the dialogue that will follow the panel representations. Let's meet our panel. So their bios are on your tables, but sitting up front here, we have representing the pro side, Seth Klein from Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And on the no side, we have Suzanne Anton from the No Proportional Representation, British Columbia. And I guess representing the learned academic side, we have Dr. Anka Kessler, who is a professor from the Department of Economics at Simon Fraser University. Now, please help me welcome our first speaker, Seth Klein.
Thanks, Doug. I'll just let you call up my slides there. And well, good morning, everyone. I am really happy to be here with you and to have this time together to discuss this important topic. Although judging from your quick little advanced survey, it's a bit of an uphill battle for me, but that's okay. And I'm delighted to be doing this with Anka and with Suzanne. This may come as a surprise, given our obvious differences, but we have a personal connection. Suzanne was at my wedding. She's very close friends with my wife's parents, and I put that out there so that you can appreciate the constraints I'm under. Unless I'm rigorously accurate and fair, it may get back to my in-laws. So I've actually been passionate about proportional representation since I was in high school. A little odd that way, and I still am passionate about PR. My view is that electoral reform, this isn't the right slide. That's at the end. Can you just start it from the beginning? Start by looking at the screen, thanks. So my view is that electoral reform and proportional representation represent a huge opportunity to strengthen our democracy, to improve policy making, to broaden the range of new ideas, and a chance to really liberate people to vote their values. I want to make the case this morning that our current electoral system is broken and ailing, and that a switch to a system of proportional representation is an opportunity to fix that. I hear a lot of fear-mongering on the no side, and I hope to dispute many of those claims. So first of all, hang on, I gotta turn this on. I might need your help too. I see, okay. There we go, I got it. So first of all, what's wrong with our current first-past-the-post electoral system? Exhibit A, I'm sorry, I know it's early in the morning. First-past-the-post is actually the exception globally among democracies. Really, there's only a few major democracies that still use it. There's the US, there's the UK, there's India and Pakistan, a few smaller former British colonies, and us. And look at their record. Trump lost the popular vote, and yet he is president, and alt-right elements live in the White House. Look at the most recent election in India, where the Modi government, which is a far-right Hindu nationalist government, won government with 31% of the vote. Exhibit B, the most recent Canadian example, is the election of Robert Ford in Ontario, where 40% of the votes got them 61% of the seats and 100% of the political power. And just yesterday invoked the notwithstanding clause to override a court decision. This is the problem that we call false majorities. Governments getting elected with less than 50% of the vote. And to give you a quick little BC history of that, because the distortions in the current system cut both ways, of course. Some of you will remember in 1996, The NDP lost the popular vote, had less than the BC Liberals, but the Liberal vote was not as efficiently distributed, and so the NDP won a false majority. 2001 is an interesting one because it's actually the only time in the last half century that a governing party won an outright majority, when Gordon Campbell won 57%. But with that 57%, he won every seat in the legislature except for 2 in East Vancouver, and the NDP lost official party status. That's not healthy to a democracy to have no loyal opposition. And then in 2005, 2009, 2013, more false majorities, that's the norm. Another problem with first past the post is that it forces people to engage in what we call strategic voting. Strategic voting means not voting your values. Effectively, our elections become a horse race between 2 parties. The bandwidth of choice and political discourse is narrowed, and we feel forced to vote strategically not for what we want, but against what we most fear or dislike. That's not real choice. If you're a free market-oriented person but frustrated with the BC Liberals, you have nowhere to go but to hold your nose or opt out. Conversely, if you are a lefty voter but frustrated with the NDP, you have nowhere to go but to suck it up and sit it out. First past the post limits real competition. There's also the fundamental problem of wasted votes, and it plays out in a couple of ways. First of all, most of us live in safe ridings where the outcome is a foregone conclusion and people feel why bother voting, and frankly it's hard to blame them. Or consider this, of the 1.9 million votes cast in the last provincial election, 1.1 million of them, over half, went towards a losing candidate, many of whom lost in close races. Surely we can think more creatively about our democracy. And then there's a fundamental policy problem, which is the one that we call policy lurch. Meaning as power and false majorities swing between 2 parties, each new government spends a chunk of its first years essentially undoing the policies of the previous government, and so the pendulum goes. And if you want to see what I mean, look no further than what's happening now in Ontario with Ford undoing the wind policies, or Trump undoing Obama, or Trudeau undoing Harper. It's inefficient and it's bad for business. Imagine if you're a clean energy or green business person in Ontario and you've invested millions only to have the new Ford government completely undo the policy context on which your business was based. In contrast, because the minority governments produced under pro-rep require compromise across parties, they are more likely to produce policies that have broad appeal and that stand the test of time. All told, I contend, first past the post is having a negative effect on our faith in democracy. That disillusionment that results from what I've just described means that many of us don't bother voting. Canada ranks 26th out of 34 countries in the OECD when it comes to voter turnout. So how would pro-rep fix some of that? So first of all, what is proportional representation? It's very simple, really. It's not a single system, but a principle. There's numerous pro-rep models. 3 of them are on the ballot. But they all have in common this. First of all, simply, the percent of the popular vote is reflected in the distribution of seats. It's stable because policies result that have real majority support and they're built to last. You don't get the policy lurches. And it's successful. 9 out of 10 top economies in the OECD use PR. PR almost always produces minority outcomes, which is great. It forces cooperation. Parties have to put together governing alliances that in combination reflect the majority of voters. A common argument against pro-rep is that it produces governments that can't get anything done. That's not true. Some of our nation's most popular and long-lasting policies, from the Canada Pension Plan to old age security to Medicare itself, were enacted under minority federal governments. And on a related point, it produces more accountable government. See, I like minority government, and I would contend they're more accountable. I think the Greens are holding the NDP more accountable than if the NDP had won an outright majority, but it's deeper than that. If you only need 40% to win outright power, you don't need to concern yourself with the other 60%. The last government, I would contend, didn't need to worry about raising welfare rates for 10 years, and for too long dragged their feet on affordable housing crisis because they didn't consider the people affected as part of their 40% base. But I'm sure you can say the same thing about the NDP on certain issues. The point is, when every vote counts, every vote matters. The vast majority of developed countries use some form of PR, and yet we're told it's too complicated. I don't believe British Columbians are somehow stupider than all of these good people. And given that most democracies use PR, it's fairly easy for people on the no side to cherry pick examples pointing to individual countries facing some challenge and seeking to pin that on the electoral system rather than any number of other variables or factors. And on the policy front, what we actually know from the evidence is that by many measures, PR countries produce better policy and have more caring societies. I want to highlight this in particular because I know the Surrey Board of Trade has consistently been very strong on poverty and inequality and homelessness, more so than any other board of trade in the province that I'm aware of. What we know from the research comparing PR versus majoritarian countries across the OECD is that PR countries have less inequality, and the results are highly statistically significant. PR countries garner higher scores on the United Nations Index of Human Development, incorporating health, education, and standard of living indicators. Overall, the empirical research across OECD countries shows that PR outperforms winner-take-all systems on measures of democracy, diversity of elected officials, values of tolerance, quality of life, income inequality, environmental performance, and fiscal policy. To delve a little bit deeper on that economic policy front, because I know that's of particular interest to you, the comparative work, so Orlan and Leithart are two of the world experts on this sort of comparative work. They find no significant relationship between electoral systems and economic growth. Another economist, Knudsen, found PR countries have about 1% per year higher economic growth than non-PR countries. But we do know that PR countries have lower corporate taxes, they have lower debt levels, they are less likely to have deficits and more likely to have fiscal surpluses, but they also have more robust social welfare programs, so they're making different choices. Now, I'm not saying there's a causal relationship here between this and PR, just that there's a correlation. The point is that the economic fear-mongering one sometimes hears is not empirically supported. The evidence is also very clear across OECD countries that voter turnout is about 7 percentage points higher under PRORAP, and for young people, it's about 12 percentage points higher. I'm not going to go into the detail, I don't have time in my allotment to go through the three systems on the ballot, but I will say this about all three of them. All three of them, I believe, are a huge improvement over what we have now. They all produce proportional outcomes reflecting what we actually vote for. I contend they not only preserve but actually enhance local representation. They will improve the diversity of the legislature. They all ensure no region will have fewer MLAs. They are all innovative, made-in-BC models that reflect our unique needs and geography. None of them will significantly increase the size of the legislature, that's capped at 8 new seats. And they all include a minimum threshold of 5%, so a party does have to get 5% in order to get a seat. And if you're still feeling nervous, the Attorney General has also committed in the regulation that there will be a second confirmation referendum after 2 election cycles if we vote to choose this time round, which is an escape clause, if you will. We get to try it out. We get to road test it for 2 elections, and then we get to vote again. And if we don't like it, we can switch back. So in sum, PRORAP incentivizes parties to make decisions together, gathering input and expertise from one another to build long-lasting policies to urgent problems that cannot simply be rolled back for partisan purposes because they are designed with the majority in mind. We deserve to have a democracy where we are liberated to vote our values, to vote for what we want, and under PRORAP, that will be the new normal. I think we have many reasons to vote yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seth. And I now welcome Suzanne to the mic.
very much. Good morning. My name is Suzanne Anton, and I'm on the no side of this debate. I'm part of the No to British Columbia Proportional Representation Society, which is a cross-partisan society. You may know, it won't take you by surprise, I'm a hardcore BC Liberal. My partner in crime and my new best friend is Bill Thielman, who's a hardcore BC NDP. And we are joined by our third co-director is Bob Plekas, who's a longtime civil servant under both NDP and BC Liberal and Social Credit governments, I believe. So the three of us are running the No to British Columbia Proportional Representation Society because we think it is a very bad idea for British Columbia. Now, how many of you know who your local MLA is? Everyone. How many of you know where your local MLA's office is? Many of you. How many of you go and talk to your local MLA about things that bug you about what government is doing? Most of you. You know how to reach your MLA. Your MLA is accountable to you. And how many of you know how the MLAs will be elected under a proportional representation system? Do you? Actually, you know why you don't know? Because none of us know. The three proposals that are in front of us today they all go so far, and then they stop and they say, oh, well, we'll work these details out later. I don't think that that's a very good system to put in front of the residents of British Columbia. We have a system right now which is very easily understandable. How many of you know how your MLA got elected? Every one of you. You all know how your MLA gets elected. And we don't know under proportional representation, and you lose that accountability. And that is fundamentally a reason why we should not ever enter into the realm of proportional representation. Both of these at the same time. Why don't we want proportional representation? Because it doesn't work. Now Seth has said, well, they love to say fear-mongering, the yes side, we're fear-mongering. Well, actually, we're just pointing out examples of how it doesn't work. Oh, sorry. They messed that one up. There we are. Latest example, and this is not called cherry picking. This is life. This is Sweden 2 days ago. See that headline in the paper at the bottom? Chaos. Sweden, like most of the northern European countries, has disintegrated into many, many small political parties. And what you lose is you lose the confidence of knowing who you're voting for. Right now, if you vote for NDP, you kind of know where you're going to go because they have put together a big tent party, they've put out their platform, and when you go into the election and you vote NDP, you know what you're getting. When you go into the election and you're voting Liberal, you kind of know what you're getting because they have got a big tent party and they go into the election. When you're in a proportional representation system, like what has happened in Sweden right now, the big parties start to disintegrate. You've got a lot of small parties. They go into the back room after the election and they decide what you're going to get. Why would you want to hand over your authority as a voter to political parties to make the decisions for you? So here's the headline or the discussion in the paper from The Guardian a couple of days ago. Across the continent, mainstream parties and alliances that once dominated national politics are in retreat, making coalition forming harder and producing weaker, potentially shorter-lived governments. In Sweden, they don't have a government right now. In Northern Ireland, they have been 600 days, a year and a half without a government. Now, as people running businesses, you need a government in place to be able to make decisions. You need ministers to be able to make decisions. Northern Ireland, they're going to go back into British rule soon because they absolutely cannot make decisions because they've got no government. Belgium went nearly a year and a half without a government. All of the Northern European countries, which Seth is pointing to, are falling into this problem, which is that the big parties are getting smaller, you get these unstable coalitions, and you do not have a government that can make decisions. All of you are, and if you're here with the Board of Trade, I assume all of you are thinking about your businesses. What is one of the most important things in your business? It's the ability to make a decision and move on. And if you have a government that cannot make a decision on your behalf, you are unable as a jurisdiction to move on, to make decisions, to do good things for your province. The great thing about what the system we have right now is the accountability. So, Premier Horgan is making decisions I don't particularly like, but you know what? I respect his ability and authority to make those decisions. Same with Doug Ford. It sounds like Seth doesn't like some of the decisions Doug Ford is making in Ontario. He is properly elected in Ontario. He's making those decisions. If you don't like what Horgan is doing now, Premier Horgan is doing now, or Premier Ford is doing in Ontario, you know what you do? You all know what you do. You vote against them in the next election. And if you really hate and feel passionately about what they're doing, you organize. And so you arrange to get the government changed. That's called accountability. That is the foundation of our system in British Columbia. That's the foundation of the first past the post system. And it's what you miss in proportional representation governments. You've got a big fat coalition government. Who made the decision? Who's accountable? Who should you get rid of in the next election? That's what you lose in proportional representation. And it's playing out very badly in Europe right now. Here's the poster choice. Again, I'm always accused of cherry picking when you talk about Italy. But Italy, 66 governments in 72 years. We all know that now this is not elections because they'll have one election, but then they'll have government after government as they try and reform and reform and reform. Because fundamentally, there's differences in the way you can choose a proportional representation system, but fundamentally, every proportional representation system is the same. It is vote for a political party, not vote for a person, and the political parties get to choose who's government and who's the policy. You are giving your vote to a political party. Now, I've been around a lot of political parties. I love people who work in political parties. I bet lots of you have helped out in elections. How many of you have? A lot of you. But who's smarter? The people in the back rooms of the political parties or the voters, in this case, of Surrey? I'll go with the voters every time. You do not want to transfer your authority to political parties. So this is the fundamental proposition of proportional representation. You are voting for a political party and you're letting them make your decisions for you. I would say that's a bad idea. You're all used to, in your own authorities, the businesses you're in, the things that you do. If you're the boss or whatever area you're in, whatever area you manage, whatever area you're in charge of, you're in charge of that. You don't want to give that authority to someone else. And here, in proportional representation, there is a vote for the political party and they make your choices for you. No matter which system of the three, which none of us can understand, so nobody will understand those three systems. You're just going to vote for a name. And the people who vote for that second part of the ballot are just going to vote for a name, because it is not possible to understand any of those systems. But they all result in the same thing, which is that the political parties themselves become the number one authority as to who's in the legislature, who becomes your so-called representatives. So, how would it play out in BC? So this is the accountability. You cannot throw the bums out. That's the fundamental problem with proportional representation. You can't get rid of people. You get backroom deals and you get people staying in power indefinitely. The ridings will be bigger. No matter what system we have, the ridings will be bigger, and it'll be harder to have a connection with your local MLA. The three different systems play out differently, but effectively that is what happens. Whoever put this, there's a little bit of poetic license in this slide, but the point is not that these guys will become MLAs, but the point is that extremism gets a foot in the door. So let me give an example of the marijuana party in British Columbia. If the marijuana party was to get 5% of the votes, they will get 4 or 5 people in the legislature. Not one of those marijuana people could ever stand in front of a riding in British Columbia and say, vote for me, and actually get elected. They wouldn't get elected. But if they can get 5% of the vote, 5 places in British Columbia get to have a marijuana person as their representative. And that, maybe we'll have one in Surrey. That's who you can go to with your problems, to the marijuana party person. That's an actual example. I'm not, the one on the right, the neo-Nazis who are now in power, or who have about almost 20% of the vote in Sweden, perhaps not so likely in our current British Columbia scenario, But the thing about proportional representation is you don't know how it's going to play out. You don't know over time how society is going to evolve and the choices people are going to make. There is no question, though, under PR, the small parties start to rise in power. Done with that one. In terms of cost, no question that the studies show that proportional representation governments cost more. About 23% of the domestic product in the systems we have now, majoritarian systems, and about 29% of proportional representation systems, so they cost more. And so is this worth the risk to us in BC? We've got a fantastic place right now, good government, stable society. Why would you want to change that? It's not broken. There is no argument for changing it in British Columbia. No argument at all. The argument that every vote counts and all that stuff doesn't mean anything. What it means is whether or not we have an accountable government, a government that can make good decisions for us, and whether or not we have a society in British Columbia which works well. Yes, we do. We have a fantastic province in a fantastic country. We are the luckiest people in the world to live here. Why would we want to change that for some uncertainty? When you get your ballot, I think are you standing up? Because I sense people hovering here.
I'm gently sidling up for 10 minutes.
It's a two-part ballot. The first part is voting for our current system or voting for a new system. I would suggest you vote for part one. And then you are able, so the question is often asked, can you ignore part two? And the answer is yes. You don't need to try voting for any of those three systems, none of which have been explained by the current government or by Elections BC. Not Elections BC fault, they cannot explain them because they're not developed. So, my recommendation, vote to keep our current system, first past the post, keep our electoral process simple, you all understand it, keep our government stable, keep our jurisdictions successful. That is what will help you and your businesses. That is what will help the municipality, the city of Surrey rather, and our province of British Columbia. Let's keep this great system that we've got right now, where your elected people are accountable and where our province continues to be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne, and I now welcome Dr. Kessler to the mic.
Thank you. So you can see I don't have a power presentation, just a couple of scribbled notes. Being the academic I am, I guess I'm trying to play to the stereotypes. Also, I'm here to be more of a neutral person, somebody who hopefully can clarify and make the arguments on both sides more or less appealing, depending on which side you stand on. As an economist, I want to say that when I'm standing in front of my classes, especially the upper division or the master classes, where people actually are going to go on to become economists, the most important lesson I tell them that they should learn is that they should learn to say, I do not know, the world is complex, and it depends. Okay? So that's really, and that's exactly, and that might be very unsatisfying to many of you, that's exactly what I'm going to say here. My bottom line will be, I don't know, the world is complex, and it depends. But I can say a few things. And I'm going to confine myself mostly to how the systems are, from an academic point of view, related to government spending and to the economic performance of countries, because I thought that would be what most people here are interested in. So point number one is there is really no systematic evidence on either side that a system is related to economic performance in the sense of lower taxes, higher deficits or lower deficits, higher or lower government spending. So for every Germany, which has a PR system, an MMP system, which is actually on the ballot, it's number 2 on the ballot right now, which is doing great. You can find, another country like Italy, for instance, where things are going awry. And if you look at the overall economic causally related to the electoral system? Are deficits causally related to the electoral systems or government spending? The answer may be a surprising no. We cannot find any causal relationship. And part of that is because the world is complex. And in some countries, the way that people work together in a proportional representation system means that spending increases because we got fringe or smaller parties that have very specific items on their wish list. They get to be the kingmakers, so that they get to be in the government coalition, and that increases spending. In other countries that are not proportional when they're first past the post, in the MLAs in the assembly, because they come from very diverse places, like in British Columbia here, they come from Surrey or from northern BC, that have very different interests. They might have the same party, but when they come together and negotiate, again, everybody at the table will have their preferred pet project. You want to get that preferred pet project through. That's how you pass the budget, so therefore spending increases. So there's no structural in the system built-in mechanism that will push people towards higher or lower spending. That's the current state of the art. And the same goes for taxes, and the same goes for deficits. New Zealand, for instance, had a very good experience with their move from the first past the post to the PR system. They went from large deficits to extraordinary fiscal prudence and very sound economy. Was that causally related to that switch? Probably not. But it's not what I'm trying to say. If you have an instinct that tells you, well, I'm worried about the PR system causing spending to increase, try to drop that instinct. Okay? But also, the opposite is also not true. Okay? So spending, deficits, taxes, we do not have any evidence that there is a systematic relationship. However, what we do have is evidence of the composition of spending being dependent on the system. So in particular, under proportional representation, there's strong, there's a number of studies that are convincing that will tell you that proportional representation, that first past the post, will result in more targeted spending. And that totally makes sense because MLAs, like Susan said, have a stronger connection to a particular, usually geographically distinct local community. And so their goal, in order to get reelected and to be for accountability reasons, they will try to enact or to implement projects, spending decisions that are in favor of that particular community. Those transfers, public services or public goods, will therefore be very targeted. Examples would be a targeted infrastructure project. We're building a bridge, or we're building a tunnel, or targeted subsidies. We're subsidizing, pig farmers in the valley because tariffs in the U.S. are hitting in particular hard. Or, particularly federal government regulation towards the film industry in BC. So these are kind of targeted transfers that you will tend to see more, transfers and public services, I should say, that you will tend to see more under first past the post. If that's what you like, first past the post is your thing. Under PR, you're going to see more spending directed toward broadly appealing policies, such as, and public services and transfers, such as education, healthcare, welfare, broadly defined, social services, these kind of things. So if you believe that the way forward, in the economy is towards more spending on public education, well then you probably are going to see more of that under a PR system. Right? That's what so the composition of spending is likely going to be changing from more targeted towards more broadly appealing public services and transfers. Having said that, okay, Is there any other reason we should or should not vote for any particular system? Well, there's a multitude, and Seth pointed some out, and he was right, and Susan pointed some out, and she was right too. But I want to, kind of zoom in on one particular, or for each of you, I guess for each of the speakers on one particular aspect. So let me start with accountability, because that really, I think, is something that people in this room are probably very concerned about. And I want to push back a little bit on what Susan said. So accountability, absolutely, of course. A first past the post system will give you a very direct link between your MLA and between you as the voter, the MLA, and then the policy that is going to be enacted. And you can, kick the MLA out whenever he does something that you do not like, or you can try to at least. The issue with accountability, however, is in the first past the post system is between elections. So while it's true that your MLA is going to be more accountable to you at the election, at the election point, in between elections, what tends to happen in first past the post systems is that the government, since it's a forced majority, becomes the de facto dictator. This is what Seth referred to as, you get to do whatever you want to for a period of time. And accountability in between elections, therefore, decreases. Because you don't have anybody you have to ask for to implement whatever policy you like. There's no more negotiations, there's no more pulling the plug on the government by junior coalition partners. Governments under first past the post tend to be very decisive, and they tend to implement policies that they want to implement. And they do not have any accountability in between. And voters, let's face it, they are forgettable. So bad things you do 4 years, you did 4 years before the current election tend to be forgotten. So, and also economic upturns will turn voters' mood very quickly. And so you can always bank on voter mood, maybe being the voters being in a good mood, even though you actually did something 3 years ago that was pretty bad. So what we tend to see in first past the post system is more electoral promises being broken. And the reason is that accountability in this particular way, in this particular dimension, is lacking. So the accountability has two sides of the coin. There's two sides of the coin. You get more accountability in one sense, but less accountability in the other. So I want to push back on that a little bit. But I also want to say something on what maybe is a worry for the proportional representation system, and that is sort of playing towards the middle side. That is that uncertainty is really a problem. Like I said, we do not know. And if you ask me to make a prediction of what is going to happen under proportional representation, the answer is, I don't have the faintest idea. The only thing I can say is that we're probably going to see more parties, and we're probably going to see a coalition government or a minority government. There's very little chance of any majority governments happening. And so people will have to negotiate. And does that mean that some extremists will come into power? Probably not, but I don't know. And some of the systems that we have on the ballot have never been tried. And that's not good. So my first instinct is always to say, well, we need institutions that will, that we've tried out. Now there is a fail-safe built in, but uncertainty is really, I think, one of the biggest arguments in favor of sticking with to our current system. So to conclude, I of course have a personal preference, but I'm not here to advocate for either side. So I'm going to keep it to myself unless you ask me to reveal it in the discussions. But let me say, like my what is my recommendation? My recommendation is, I do not know, the world is complex, and, you know, it depends. So, with this, I let it be. Thank
Thank you very much, Dr. Kessler. What a wonderful three presenters, and I feel